History is full of myths and misconceptions that spread easily. Some of them have been popularized on TV and in pop culture, and some have even made it into school history textbooks. In this video, we're going to debunk a bunch of the most prevalent ones and separate fact from fiction. Nagasaki was not the intended target for the second nuclear attack on Japan. The actual planned target was a completely different city called Kokura. Due to a delay of the aircraft getting to the city, clouds and fog had drifted over the area, obscuring the target. As well as that, there was a significant amount of smoke from the fires of US bombing runs that had happened the day before. The plane flew over Kokura for around an hour but was unable to see where to drop the nuke, with the aircraft running low on fuel and the Japanese anti-air weapons coming closer to shooting down the plane. The pilots then decided to head to the secondary backup target of Nagasaki. It arrived an hour later and found the city was also covered in clouds, but last minute the pilots found a small hole in the clouds which was just enough to make visual contact with the target. Although the Fat Man bomb was actually more powerful than the Little Boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima 3 days prior, because of Nagasaki's cloud cover, the bomb missed its intended target by around 2 miles and didn't cause as much destruction as Hiroshima, with the valley's hills absorbing some of the blast. The Trojan Horse was most likely a myth or legend and might not have actually existed. It's one of the most famous stories in history that the Greeks, during a long battle and siege of Troy, built a giant wooden horse which the Trojans took into the city believing it was a gift and they had surrendered. The Greeks would later sneak out of the horse in the middle of the night to open the gates of Troy and allow the Greek army to capture the city. While there is archaeological evidence that the Trojan Wars did occur around 1200 BC, there is no evidence of a horse. We only know about the Trojan Wars because one of the earliest and most important writers in history, called Homer, wrote the Odyssey around 750 BC, a poem describing the legends of the Trojan Wars and the battles between King Agamemnon and Achilles, which were ancient history to him when he wrote about this, but it only briefly mentions a wooden horse. It was only until much later, around 20 BC, when a Roman poet called Virgil wrote the Aeneid. This contained a much more detailed poem about the Trojan Horse, which we all know today. But again, it's important to note these are just poems and not historical accounts, written 500 and 1,000 years after the actual Trojan Wars. Some historians believe the story of the wooden horse may have come from mythology, which Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were full of, used as metaphors and analogies, or they could have been misunderstandings of the usage of siege engines. These were used to break down the gates of a city under siege, or use its height for the men inside to climb over the walls and breach it. George Washington did not have wooden teeth. This is a myth that became commonly accepted in the 1900s and has even been in American school textbooks as a fact until recently. Washington was said to have cracked walnuts with his teeth and took a smallpox medicine which also damages them. This led to his first tooth being removed by age 24, and he only had one tooth remaining by his inauguration at age 57. Because of this, he used many sets of dentures made out of different materials common in the 1700s, and one of those pairs of dentures are still on display at museums today for us to look at. Some of them included human donor teeth from slaves or poorer people who often sold their teeth because they were valuable, and his French dentist recorded payments of 122 shillings for each of them. Other teeth and denture sets were made of brass, lead, gold, animal teeth, and ivory from hippos, which would quickly stain and turn brown, giving the appearance as if they were made out of wood. Washington wrote in his diaries that his disfigured mouth would often cause him pain and make his lips bulge, and this can be seen in many of his portraits and even his most famous image on the $1 bill. The samurais were not against using guns. Firearms were actually used extensively throughout the age of the samurai, and Japan was one of the most advanced users of guns in the world during the 16th century, said to have more than most European countries. They called them Tanegashima, which were matchlock guns they first got from the Portuguese traders that had shipwrecked on Tanegashima Island in 1543. The Japanese quickly reverse engineered and mass produced their own, even improving the designs to make some of them waterproof and rapid firing. Hollywood media has often romanticized the myth that samurais found guns dishonorable, when many battles were fought using mainly firearms for hundreds of years in Japan. The longbow was still more useful in some situations, and the katana sword was always a samurai's most sacred weapon, but guns were still a regular part of the arsenal. The use of guns did decline for a period around the 18th and 19th centuries, with the country entering an era of peace where not many wars were fought, and the government also introduced restrictions wanting to limit people having them to use for uprisings. The use of guns picked back up by the mid-19th century as Japan modernized its military and adopted westernized warfare strategies to build what would become the imperial army. Jesus likely didn't have long hair. If you look at any image of him, you'll probably see the ones we all know of a man with long, flowing hair, but this is actually based on artists from the Middle Ages, where long hair was much more common at the time. Jewish men around Jesus' times almost always had short to medium length hair. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it's a disgrace to him?" While this can't be relied on as pure fact and its meaning is open to interpretation, it does seem unlikely that he would say this if Jesus himself had long hair. Many artists in the Middle Ages, when depicting Jesus, wanted to artistically show him as powerful and beautiful, similar to philosophers and legendary figures like Zeus, to make him stand out in their paintings, but this is just their impression of someone that lived 1500 years before them. The oldest surviving paintings of Jesus from around the year 235 show a man with normal hair length, and much of the oldest art of Jesus ever found also shows something similar. So we don't know for sure what he looked like, but it is unlikely that these more modern images are accurate. Christopher Columbus never stepped foot on the mainland of North America. His first landing was in the Bahamas and then went on to Cuba and Hispaniola. In his second voyage, he went to Puerto Rico, Jamaica, and Dominica, and then his third voyage, he reached the coast of Venezuela, and in his final voyage, he went to Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. He died shortly after in 1506, having never reached the North American mainland, and died refusing to believe that the Americas were new continents, certain that the lands he visited were somewhere in Asia, despite many of his peers telling him that this was not Asia. The American Civil War was not fought over some general states' rights, it was directly around slavery. There is sometimes a narrative that slavery was not the main focus of the war, and instead it was around economic policies or federal authority or the autonomy of the states. Technically, the Civil War was fought because the states seceded, but slavery was the main reason for their secession, and almost every state mentions that explicitly. In Mississippi's Declaration of Secession, they stated, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." The Declaration ordinances of South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas all specifically mention their fundamental rejection of Abraham Lincoln's government attempting to abolish slavery, and they go on to detail the economic effect it would have on their states and also why they believed it was unconstitutional to deprive them of this right to own people. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the new Confederacy government, said in a speech that the cornerstone of this new government is the slave. So the main state's right that the Civil War was fought over was the right to own slaves, which the seceding states believed was essential to their prosperity. Napoleon wasn't actually short. This might be one of the biggest myths in history, and even later spawned its own term, Napoleon complex. This is used to describe shorter men that are overly aggressive to compensate for their height. Napoleon's actual height was around 5'7", which was slightly above average for France in the 1700s. There are two main reasons he came to be known as short. Firstly, France at the time used their own French measurement system, where inches were longer than the standard British imperial system, which is widely used today. So in French inches, he was recorded as 5'2". So if you saw that written down without context, you would think that was short. The second reason this myth became popular is essentially British propaganda. He was the boogeyman of Europe for his legendary conquests and Britain's main rival, so the media regularly portrayed him in political cartoons as small to mock and undermine him, downplaying his height to show him as weak. In addition, it was said that his personal elite imperial guards were among the best in his army and often with impressive physical stature, so many of them would have been tall, sometimes making Napoleon appear shorter than the guards he surrounded himself with. The Colossus of Rhodes did not stand like this at each side of the harbour. If you search up images of it, most will look like this, with this enormous statue having feet on both sides and ships passing between its legs, but this is not actually how it was. The statue, built in 280 BC, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which were the most notable structures that used to exist in ancient times, with the Pyramids of Giza being the only surviving one. Because of this, we can only go off the accounts of people who actually witnessed them at the time, and historical sources like Pliny the Elder describe the Colossus of Rhodes as standing on one side of the harbour, and others describe the single pedestal made of marble. It would have been structurally impossible for it to stand like this for many reasons. It was around 108 feet tall, so the same size as the actual Statue of Liberty itself, so it wouldn't have been able to stand with its feet spread like that, as well as that it's widely believed to have been made of bronze, so it would have collapsed under its own weight if it was stood in that posture. It also took around 12 years to build, so this main entrance to the very important city would have had to have been closed the entire time. The myth of it being stood like this came from middle-aged depictions well after it was destroyed, and this popular image caught on. It was even mentioned by Shakespeare twice, and one of those sonnets was placed inside the Statue of Liberty, mentioning its limbs being astride from land to land, so the myth went pretty far. The TV show Game of Thrones also has a statue called the Titan of Braavos, inspired by the Colossus. The Colossus stood for 54 years until a powerful earthquake in 226 BC made it snap at the knees and fall to the ground, where it lay for another 800 years, still being so remarkable that people travelled the world to see its remains still on the floor. It wasn't rebuilt because it would have been too expensive, and there were fears it would collapse again. It was eventually taken apart and sold for valuable scrap. Cleopatra was not ethnically Egyptian. She's one of the most well-known figures in history as the queen or pharaoh of her Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, up there with other well-known ancient Egyptian pharaohs like Tutankhamun or Ramses the Great, but Cleopatra and her family were ethnically Greek, or Macedonian to be specific. She descended from Ptolemy I, who was a general and companion of Alexander the Great, who conquered Egypt and also made himself pharaoh briefly. But Ptolemy succeeded him and founded his own Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule Egypt for 300 years. This family was well known for its strict inbreeding and sibling marriages, which was common for royalty at the time, but the aim was to keep the bloodline purely Greek, no mixing allowed. She was the first and only Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language and try to adopt their cultures and customs, but Cleopatra herself and her upbringing was entirely Greek, and she would have shared no blood with the Egyptians she ruled over. She even married both of her brothers, but she did eventually have a child with Julius Caesar, nicknamed Caesarion, and 3 with Mark Antony, which broke the tradition of the pure Greek bloodline. Caesarion was the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty until he was killed at age 17 by Octavian or Augustus, the first Roman emperor, who finally ended the Greek rule over Egypt and annexed it into the Roman Empire. This map is not accurate. Greenland is nowhere near the size of Africa, and Russia and Canada are not as big as they look here. This is because flattening the surface of a round Earth onto a flat map for us to look at is actually impossible without having weird distortions or cutting it into pieces. So what you see on Google Maps is not the accurate sizes of the countries. It's called the Mercator projection, and there's another myth that this map was made to make Europe look big and continents like Africa look small, but this also isn't true. It was actually invented for very good reason in the 1500s by a man named Mercator, because this is by far the best way to navigate the Earth on ships and was the most reliable way to calculate where you're going. Before this, sailors constantly got lost, so the invention of this distorted projection was a very important turning point in the history of navigation. The downside is it does distort the sizes of land masses, so land closer to the equator is more accurate in size, but land closer up to the poles is distorted to be much bigger than they really are. This cool website shows the true size of countries, so if you drag Colombia or Nigeria next to Greenland, they also appear massive, but if you drag Greenland down to Africa, you'll see its true size. The only truly accurate map is of course to look at a round globe. The pyramids were not built by slaves. This is a very popular myth, as the Pyramids of Giza are some of the most impressive structures ever built. This leads some to assume that such a feat could only have been achieved by massive amounts of forced labor, but this is not true. In fact, because the pyramids are so well built and still standing today, it's a testament to the level of skilled craftsmanship and care needed to create them. Among the builders were highly skilled and capable mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers. Just minor mistakes or errors in measurements would throw off the entire structure, and everything had to be made to precision for them to have survived this long and to be aligned to the stars. Proof of this has been found nearby, as archaeologists have uncovered the workers' village near Giza, which shows living quarters with the bakeries and medical facilities and a whole community of this highly skilled workforce that constructed them over decades. It's certainly possible that some forced labor could have been used to help move some of the blocks from the quarry to the construction site, as slavery was present basically everywhere in the world throughout most of human history. But specifically in Egyptian culture at the time, slavery was mostly only used for domestic servants and for agriculture. To this day, nobody knows for certain exactly how they were built. All we have are theories, and the world's smartest scholars and engineers still fiercely debate the methods used to assemble the limestone blocks, but especially how to lift and perfectly cut the granite blocks that line the king's chamber, which weigh up to 80 tons. People in ancient times lived much longer than age 30. From around 3500 BC up until the 1900s, the average life expectancy was around 30 years old. Some people think that adults just died around 30, but this is not true. This number is massively distorted and dragged down because of infant mortality. It is true that making it past infancy was much more difficult than it is today because of modern medicine, sanitation, nutrition, and general education of the human body. Throughout most of history, people didn't know about the existence of germs, and doctors would often perform autopsies or work on diseased bodies right before delivering babies without washing their hands. Obviously, wealth would raise your chances of survival, but there are many people who were not wealthy and still lived long lives. To name a few popular examples, Socrates, Confucius, and the Buddha, who all lived humbly around 400 BC, made it into their 70s and 80s. Harriet Tubman, who was born into slavery in 1822, lived to 91 years old. Gandhi was born in 1869 and lived to be 78 years old. And Nelson Mandela was born in 1918 and lived 95 years. All of these are of course just a few examples of well-known people, but they did spend most of their lives in poverty and turmoil. Of course, there are many millions more people who weren't famous, whose names we don't know, that also made it to old age. And thankfully these days we've come a long way, and the average life expectancy around the world is roughly 80 years old. All dinosaurs did not go extinct. While it's commonly understood that 66 million years ago a massive extinction event wiped out 75% of all life on Earth, some of the dinosaurs actually survived and did evolve into animals still around today. When you say dinosaur, people often think of the T-Rex or the Triceratops or Velociraptors, and all of those were indeed wiped out, but many of the flying or avian species of dinosaurs survived. Modern birds are in fact direct descendants of the small feathered theropod dinosaurs, so scientifically, birds are considered living dinosaurs. The fossil record proves that birds share skeletal features with theropod dinosaurs, like their hollow bones, their pelvic structure, and feathers, and modern genetic analysis also confirms that birds we see today are in fact a group of theropod dinosaurs, and they are the only direct surviving descendants. Julius Caesar did not burn down the Library of Alexandria. It's a commonly believed myth that he destroyed a significant amount of knowledge and set humanity back. The Library of Alexandria was at the time one of the world's largest collections of scrolls, history, and recorded knowledge, located in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great. When Caesar invaded Egypt in pursuit of Pompeii, he was trapped by the Egyptian army and ordered his own ships at the dock to be burned down so they wouldn't fall into enemy hands. According to sources, this fire did spread to parts of the city and burn down a storehouse of scrolls near the library, but these were mostly unimportant commercial trading records around the dock and not the Great Library itself. Many accounts document the library still existing after this time, although in the following centuries, due to neglect and lack of funding, it gradually deteriorated, becoming abandoned, and then following several wars and invasions, what was left ceased to exist. This happened gradually over hundreds of years after Caesar, and much of the knowledge it used to hold was transferred to other cities and libraries that were built around the world. Jesus was not born on December 25th. The exact date is unknown, but there is evidence that points to the real date potentially being sometime in the summer months. The Bible does not say anywhere that Jesus was born in December or even the winter. The Gospel of Luke mentions shepherds in the fields watching over their flocks, and in ancient Judea, much like most of the world, the shepherds keep their animals indoors during the winter months. Luke also mentions that the Roman Emperor Augustus ordered a census at the time, and these were usually carried out in the spring or summer months because it was easier to travel. The Gospel of Matthew mentions a bright star of Bethlehem in the sky at the time of his birth, which astronomers believe could have been the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn or Venus, which occurred in June. or even a supernova or comet, which the Chinese had recorded at the time as happening in the summer. Early Christians didn't celebrate Jesus' birth, but hundreds of years later in 336, the newly Roman Church chose December 25th to replace the winter solstice festivals and have a unified specific date for the whole Roman Empire. The Salem Witch Trials did not burn anyone at the stake. This is a myth that became popularized in TV shows and movies, leading to a misconception about what actually happened. Between 1692 and 3 in the colony of Massachusetts, more than 200 people were accused of witchcraft. Of those, 30 were found guilty, and of those, 19 were executed, all by hanging. 14 women and 5 men, and another man was pressed to death for refusing to enter a plea, but none were burned. Unlike in Europe, some accused witches were burned at the stake, and this is likely where the myth around the Salem trials comes from, because it's the biggest and most well-known witch trial in America, but it never involved any burning. It started when a few local women in the village of Salem were accused of witchcraft by 4 young girls: Betty, aged 9, Abigail, who was 11, Anne, who was 12, and Elizabeth, who was 17. In the years following, several of these accusers, who were mostly teenage girls, later admitted that they had fabricated their claims, and the practice was soon stopped. Abigail accused a total of 57 people, and Anne named and testified against more than 60 people. Some adults who even dared to accuse the teenagers of lying would themselves be put on trial for witchcraft. Historians believe that most of the accusations were because of family feuds and rivalries, and many of the victims' families would later receive compensation due to the loss of life and some of their properties being confiscated after the convictions. The Spanish flu did not come from Spain. The name is actually misleading, as its origin has a strange story. The Spanish flu of 1918 to 19 was one of the most deadly diseases in history. Unlike typical seasonal flu, which is more dangerous for the young and old, Spanish flu was extremely contagious and unusual because it was most lethal for young adults as well as the young and old. It infected around 500 million people, which was a third of the world's population at the time, claiming the lives of around 50 million people, with the highest estimates at around 100 million. Nobody knows exactly where it originated, but the earliest documented case was in Kansas in the United States. This occurred towards the end of World War I, so most countries involved in the war had a media ban on talking about it because no country wanted to disclose that millions of their soldiers were being affected by this disease, as it would expose weaknesses. But Spain was a neutral country not involved in the war, so it was the first to report on it and gain public attention. Because of this, it became known as the Spanish flu, even though it didn't originate from there. People in the Middle Ages knew the Earth was round. It's one of the most popular myths that's found in some school textbooks and pop culture, that people in the Middle Ages were ignorant around the shape of the planet. The truth is that ancient civilizations knew the Earth was a sphere just by observing the moon and stars. Ancient Greeks like Aristotle was one of the first to prove it by pointing out that ships disappear from the bottom first when sailing over the horizon, and that the Earth's shadow cast a round shape over the moon during a lunar eclipse. Eratosthenes was the first to properly calculate the circumference of the Earth around 240 BC by measuring shadows cast at 2 different locations, and then using the distance between the 2 places to calculate the circumference at 39,000 kilometers, which is impressively close to the true size, which is around 40,000. So we've known the Earth's shape for a long time, and Columbus even knew this, which is why he decided to reach Asia by sailing around the other way, although he did think the Earth was smaller than it actually was, which is why he believed to his dying day that the Caribbean islands he found were in Asia. Cinco de Mayo is not Mexican Independence Day. In fact, it's hardly even celebrated in Mexico, but in the United States, it's become one of the biggest holidays of the year, celebrating Mexican culture and with beer sales said to be equal to that of the Super Bowl. Cinco de Mayo is actually a celebration of the Mexicans defeating the French in a specific battle on the 5th of May, 1862. This was a turning point to them later ending the French occupation in 1866. Mexican Independence Day, however, is the biggest and most important holiday in Mexico, celebrating when they gained independence from Spain back in 1821. Cinco de Mayo later became a big US holiday mainly because of advertising companies who saw it as an easy way to market food, alcohol, festivities, parades, and pretty much another excuse to party.